Hey guys, what's up? Today we are going to be doing things a little differently. This last month, the month of August, we got a free trial of HBO Max at my house. And because of that, there were a ton of movies that we just hadn't seen yet. And I think I logged over 60 movies that month. So instead of writing out an entire script for all of those, like I would normally do, I'm going to do a bit of a speed round where I just kind of unscriptedly go through as fast as I can, all like 60 something of them. There'll be a count for how many there are because this is very interesting. We'll see how this goes. If it goes horribly, that's unfortunate, but for time's sake, let's get right into it. So on August 1st, I watched The Dark Knight. The Dark Knight is one of my favorite comic book movies. It doesn't quite probably need the 5 stars I gave it, but I gave it 5 stars because I just really like it. I really like Christopher Nolan and his style and everything. So that was a rewatch. Then I watched Hamilton, the recording on Disney Plus, which I gave 5 stars. Amazing, right? I think Hamilton is a really great musical. I would love to go see it live. I love the soundtrack. It's really, really well done. Next, I watched Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 1 for the podcast that me and my brother do called Recently Logged. I gave it 4 stars. I think it's maybe a little boring and not very well adapted from the book because it's a like a 2-parter for a 1 book kind of thing. So I don't think it's great, but I still think it's really well made, which is why I gave it 4 stars. Next, I watched Treasure Planet for the first time, which was about what I expected. It's pretty mediocre. The animation was pretty cool. It's just kind of sad that is what came out of the people behind so many of the greats of Disney, and this was their passion project. I forget who it is. Here, let me check real quick. I can do that. Yeah, Ron Clements and John Musker. They were behind stuff like Aladdin and things like that. And the real passion project was Treasure Planet, and then it ended up coming out and not doing very well. After that, I watched a old German mystery movie kind of thing. I gave it 4 stars. I think it's pretty good, but I do think there are some rough things technically in it. But yeah, it was definitely a good time. Next, we had a quick little Disney Plus escapade where we watched Minutemen, which was pretty darn bad. I gave that 2 stars. And then How to Build a Better Boy, which was even worse. I gave 1 star. Next, we watched My Neighbor Totoro, which I had seen before. I think it's a great movie. It's not as good as it could be. I think there's definitely some things on a screenplay level that they could change around with it, but I gave it 4 stars. Next, I rewatched The Peanut Butter Falcon, which I think was one of the best from 2019. It's a really fun movie. I think Shia LaBeouf does a great job. I gave that 4.5 stars. Next, I watched Porco Rosso, which was the first time watching that. I thought it was pretty good. Again, like a lot of the Ghibli films, I feel like it's just off of being like amazing. Like it's really good, but it's just off of being like great. And I don't know, that's just how I ended up feeling about most of the Studio Ghibli movies. Next, I watched Green Lantern for the first time, which wasn't as bad as I expected it to be, but it was still pretty bad, so I gave it 2 stars. Next, I watched Hail Caesar, which I have seen before, and I actually did an episode about it on the podcast before. And I've talked about it on here before. I think it's pretty funny. Nowhere near Coen Brothers at their best. It's unfortunately like kind of a mess at some points, but it still is very funny. I gave it 3.5. Next, I watched F is for Fake, but I kind of didn't watch all of it. I missed like the first 30 minutes probably, so I didn't give it a rating. Next, I watched School of Rock for the first time, which was crazy that I had never seen it, but also crazy how good it was. I gave it 4.5 stars. Next, I watched Scoob, which I thought was kind of trash. It's kind of in the trend of animation that I just think is awful that comes out lately. But, it is what it is, unfortunately. Next, I watched Batman Under the Red Hood, which was a lot more discombobulated than I thought it would be. Like, it was kind of all over the place with its story, but it was still interesting enough. I gave it 3 stars. Next, I watched Eraserhead for the first time, which that's a wild movie. I could truthfully say I've never seen anything like that. On my first watch, I gave it 3.5 stars. Next, I watched Blast from the Past, and dumb Brendan Fraser movie, but it was fun. It was fine, so I gave it 2.5 stars. Next, I watched Osmosis Jones, which was horrifying. I kind of hated it, and I can't believe that was greenlit and made. I gave it 2 stars. Next, I watched Ponyo, which again was a rewatch of one of the Ghibli films, and I think it has not similar problems to Totoro, but similar vein. Like, it's just not great. It's really, really good, but it's just not great, so I give it 4 stars. Next, I watched The Adjustment Bureau, which was, I think it was a Matt Damon movie. Yeah, it was Matt Damon. Very odd. Can't say I was too much of a fan of it, even though I really did like the cast, because it was Matt Damon and Emily Blunt, but unfortunately the movie just wasn't very good. I gave it 2.5 stars. Next, I rewatched Eraserhead, this time with my brother, and on this watch I actually gave it 4 stars. I liked it a bit more. Then I watched The Maltese Falcon for the first time, which I had heard the story before, but I hadn't watched the movie. I thought it was very good. I gave it 4.5 stars. Next, I watched Eyes Without a Face, a classic-ish horror movie, French horror movie, I think. I thought it could have been better. I don't think there was a whole lot of tension to it, but it was still very enjoyable. I gave it 3.5 stars. Next, I watched Ocean Waves, another Ghibli movie, a little bit less well-known, and for good reason, honestly. It wasn't the greatest. I gave it 3 stars, but honestly, it could have gone with a 2.5, which is kind of sad coming from Ghibli. Next, I watched Mission Impossible Fallout, just one of my favorite action movies of all time. Like, just, go watch this movie if you haven't. Like, it's so good. I gave it 4.5 stars. Next, I watched Contagion for the first time. It was very odd for Steven Soderbergh. I'm a relatively big Steven Soderbergh fan with like Ocean's 11 and Logan Lucky and stuff like that. And this was odd. It kind of played out more like a montage than your average movie. So it was odd. I gave it 3 stars though. I kind of enjoyed it, and it was very interesting watching it in the time that we are living through. Next, I rewatched Rango, and Rango is always a good time. It's just such a surprising animated film. The animation is great. The story is interesting. The cinematography is absolutely insane. I can't believe that got approved. I gave it 4 stars. Next, I watched The Man Who Knew Too Much for the first time. A little underwhelming, honestly. I thought it would be better. It was fine. Who doesn't like Peter Lorre? But Peter Lorre's character in this one was just fine. I gave it 3.5. Next, I watched Madagascar, and I mean, Madagascar is a classic. It's stupid, but it's pretty funny. I rather enjoy it. I give it 3.5 stars. Next, I watched She's the Man. Uh, Very whack. Channing Tatum. I don't know what to tell you about this one. It was weird. I think it was a playoff of a Shakespeare play, and it was just odd. I gave it 3 stars. Next, I watched Mars Attack, Tim Burton, for the first time, and that was very disappointing, to say the least. I was really hoping something very good, and it didn't end up being very good. I ended up giving it 2 stars. Next, I watched The Secret World of Arrietty, another Studio Ghibli film. This one I was definitely not a fan of. I had a lot of problem with the writing, which I could go into more detail of. In fact, I sent like an entire paragraph and a half to my friend who really liked this movie when they asked me my opinion. Sorry about that. I gave it 3 stars. Next, I watched Drop Dead Fred, which was trash. No offense to Drop Dead Fred or anybody who likes it or anything, but man, it was really dumb, really stupid, not my kind of humor at all. I thought the story was kind of odd and discombobulated. I gave it 2 stars. Next, I watched Train to Busan for the first time, which I was really excited about, and it ended up being very good. I gave it 4.5 stars. It's definitely my favorite zombie movie that I've seen. Next, I watched An American Pickle for the first time. Very odd movie. I didn't know what to expect of it. I'm not the biggest Seth Rogen fan, but, this movie I think he actually did a really good job with. I really liked, what's his name? Oh no, I lost his name. Herschel. Yes, Herschel. Herschel was one of my favorite characters, from this year, from 2020. I rated An American Pickle 4 stars. Next, I watched The Raven, the 1935 The Raven, and it was kind of disappointing because it was a very cool concept, and I think they could have done it a lot better, but it was just kind of mediocre. I gave it 3 stars. Next, I watched Princess Mononoke for the first time, which that was just really good. It's one of my favorite Studio Ghibli movies now. I think it's just like really, really well made and well written. I gave it 4.5 stars. Next, I watched The Wind Rises, another Ghibli. This one is a little bit more odd than most. I think it comes off a little bit different in tone and pacing and structure and everything than most Ghibli movies. But it was still interesting. I watched the end again recently, and it was odd. I don't know. I'm not sure how I fully feel about that one, but I gave it 4 stars. Next, I rewatched Tangled, which I really, really like Tangled. Unfortunately, it has quite a bit of problems with pacing and stuff like that, so that is unfortunate, but it's still really enjoyable. The soundtrack is great. The characters are great. I gave it 3 stars. Next, I watched The Cave. Perfect for 3 a.m. watches. I can confirm this because that's when I watched this. It wasn't good at all. It was really, really kind of boring and disappointing, but I didn't really expect much, so I don't know, 2 stars. Next, I watched The Speed Cubers, which was unfortunately not feature length, so I didn't end up giving it a rating, but I really liked it, especially being that I did Speed Cube for a while. I competed in a couple competitions, and it was really cool seeing something showing that kind of world off a little bit, especially from something like Netflix. Next, I watched The Dark Knight Rises, probably my least favorite Christopher Nolan movie, but I still think it's really good. It's just got a lot of writing and pacing problems that I just make the movie kind of boring, and I wish there was more Bane. But anyway, I still think it's pretty good. I gave it 3.5 stars. Next, I watched The Invisible, a horror movie, thriller movie, a trash movie. That's what I'm looking for. A trash movie. The story sucked. The pacing was awful. I really didn't like any of the characters. The actors were varying from okay to bad performances. It just was bad. It was rough. I gave it 1 star. Next, I watched The Lost World, Jurassic Park. I actually watched it on a tiny little TV on a VHS, which was very cool. Unfortunately, The Lost World just isn't that great of a movie. I think it's got a lot of pacing and structure problems. It's extremely slow and discombobulated, and I really don't like Jeff Goldblum's daughter's character. No, not Goldblum's daughter's character. Jeff Goldblum's character's daughter. I think she's really not well written at all. But I gave that 3 stars. Next, I watched The Martian, which is actually a movie that I really like, even though I know some people, specifically my brother, who don't like it much. I think it's like peak Matt Damon for me, and I really like Ridley Scott's direction. I gave it 4.5 stars. Next, I watched Another Earth, which was an odd indie sci-fi film that was just kind of mediocre all around. I gave it 2.5. Next, I watched Castle in the Sky, another Ghibli film. I thought this was actually really good. I think this made my top 5 Studio Ghibli. I just thought it was really well done. It was my cup of tea, if you will. I gave it 4.5 stars. Next, I watched Boys State, a documentary from this year, from A24 actually. I thought it was really good. I thought it was really interesting. Very sad who ended up winning at the end, but, you know, it was still very, very good. Very well made. I gave it 4.5 stars. Next, I watched There Will Be Blood for the first time, which I didn't know what to expect, but man, it was really, really good. It was, like, it's up there for just really darn good movies. Like, the score, amazing. Cinematography amazing, acting amazing, writing amazing. This movie is really great. It wasn't quite there because I don't like the story. Not that the story wasn't well written, but there are some things I don't like about the story, so I ended up giving it 4.5. Next, I watched Batman: The Dark Knight Returns Part 1 for the first time, and I thought it was trash. I'm not sure why so many people like this. It was just throw stuff against the wall until something sticks. And literally whoever wrote the dialogue for the mutants or whatever needs to be fired so hard. I almost turned this movie off because their dialogue was so horrible.
You see, Don? Batman nasty. Shh. Leader's bargain. Leader Billy berserk, Rob. He pegged Batman, you see.
The story was stupid. It was just all over the place. I gave it 2 stars. But I thought that was bad. Just wait till I watched Batman: The Dark Knight Returns Part 2. It was even freaking worse. This movie was trash. This was even more just throw stuff against the wall and see if it sticks than the last one. And guess what? Nothing stuck but Joker dying and Joker being in it. Like, this was awful. Why do people like these movies? Like, I know some people who really like these movies, and they're horrible. I gave it 1.5 stars. Next, I watched Whisper of the Heart, another Ghibli movie. I think it has some pacing problems, but I think it's still pretty good. I gave it 4 stars. Next, I watched Beverly Hills Chihuahua. It's Beverly Hills Chihuahua. I gave it a 0.5 star. Next, I watched Can a Computer Write a Hit Musical? Documentary filmmaking-wise, it was kind of mediocre, but the story was pretty cool. Unfortunately, the results were kind of meh. I gave it 3 stars. Next, I watched The Cat Returns, probably the most whack of the Ghibli movies, besides something like Pom Poko. It was very odd and very odd connections to Whisper of the Heart, but I still very much enjoyed it, and I gave it 3.5 stars. Next, I watched Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2 for the podcast. It's one of my favorite Harry Potter movies, up there, I think, at like number 2 ranked for me. I gave it 4.5 stars. Next, I rewatched Train to Busan. Next, I watched The Pirates Who Don't Do Anything, a VeggieTales movie. This is the stuff that I grew up on, and it actually holds up decently well. It's still got some awful pacing problems, but it still can be pretty fun to watch. I gave it 3 stars. Next, I watched Dick Tracy for the first time, and it kind of just felt like a Batman, like Tim Burton Batman ripoff, and I didn't think it was very good at all. I gave it 2 stars. Next, I watched Phineas and Ferb, the movie Candace Against the Universe. I thought it was kind of disappointing, especially coming from, like, Phineas and Ferb, one of my favorite shows, and, something I grew up on. But I gave it 3 stars on my first watch. Next, I watched Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. I really liked this. I actually almost cried at the end. I'm thinking about doing a video about it. We'll see how that goes. I gave it 4 stars. Next, I watched The Circus. This was, I think, my first Charlie Chaplin movie. Very funny, very good. He's good at comedy. Though I feel like this wasn't really the concept for me. Like, I don't like the ending, and setting-wise, I wasn't a big fan, but it was still really funny. I gave it 4.5. Next, I watched Tales from Earthsea, which was another Ghibli movie. This one was actually kind of surprising. I didn't know what to expect from it. It was directed by Hayao Miyazaki's son, and it was pleasantly surprising. I thought it was really good. I liked that it was a little bit more of an American structured story. It was based off of an American novel, and you can definitely tell a little bit in the structure. And I thought it made it a lot more story propelled than a lot of the other ones, so I really liked that. I gave it 4 stars. Next, I rewatched Phineas and Ferb the movie Candace Against the Universe for the podcast. This time around, I rated it 2.5. Like I said, it's just very disappointing to see that come out of my favorite TV show. It's growing up in one of my favorite TV shows now. And to end the month off on the 31st, I watched When Marnie Was There, another Studio Ghibli movie. It was good, but it was definitely not my cup of tea when it comes to stories. Like, I could tell there was a lot of passion put into it, but I felt like the story definitely wasn't for me, so it kind of missed the emotional core for me a little bit. But it was still very good. I gave it 4 stars, and that was the month of August. It was a lot, man, Unscripted doing this, speed running it took my breath away a little bit. It's going to be real fun to edit, I'm sure. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Thank you for watching this far, and if you did, if not, cool anyway. There will be a video or 2, maybe just 1 coming out this month. We'll see how it goes. So I hope you guys will enjoy that. Please like and subscribe, and especially share. A lot of problems getting channels like these going is building initial community, and I'm trying to build that up more. I've gotten a lot more engagement. You guys are great. I'm glad you enjoy what I'm making, and I'm definitely happy to be making more of it. So hopefully I can continue doing that. And also hopefully my videos will get back to more movie-based things, because, well, I've done 3 video game videos in a row, and this isn't a video game channel, but I mean, I really like video games, so I don't know. But anyway, until next time, goodbye.
If you have a milkshake, and I have a milkshake, and I have a straw, there it is, that's a straw, you see, watching, and my straw reaches across the room and starts to drink your milkshake. I drink your milkshake. I drink it up!
Don't bully me, Daniel!